As you've alluded to a number of times, Buchanan wasn't just a critic of higher education. He was also an institution builder within it. And he was first at UVA, then a stop at UCLA, then Virginia Tech, and finally George Mason University. Give me an overview of his journey through academia and and what he built as he traversed it.
It's very interesting. When he died in 2013, and before I got access to his archives, there was a memorial conference for him that I attended. And one of his colleagues, who is one of these key, Koch faculty figures, a guy named Tabarrok, said that Buchanan understood from the beginning that we needed a movement. I think that's a direct quote. I don't have the notes in front of me, but basically Buchanan saw the need for a movement. So from that very first center that he created in Charlottesville in 1956 with money from the Ultra Free Market Foundation of the time, that was also, well, anyway, I don't want to go too far in the weeds, but it was the key free market fundamentalist funder. He got 5-year startup funding from that organization, and from the beginning approached his academic work as movement building. And so he would bring in these visiting speakers who were part of the free market cause. He made sure to get fellowships endowed for students, and the early students, by the telling of people who were there, would all come in sporting their Ayn Rand $ tie pins. It was really like a movement culture in academia, and they were a very tight-knit group. He always insisted on separate quarters for his ideological team from the rest of the economics department. And so they were constantly thinking about how to, and in those days it was all men, and it still is overwhelmingly men, but how to bring in men into this cause. He called them our boys. How to bring the boys into the cause, get them inculcated in these ideas, essentially get them set up for a life in academic careers that in most cases then would be subsidized by the donors. And he did that in institution after institution with funding from right-wing foundations, such as SCAFE in the 1970s, Koch later on, et cetera. But so the donors, the corporate arch-right donors would provide the funding that would enable all of this movement building, and that's what they did. And so they trained people, many of whom went into academic jobs, but because many of Buchanan's students couldn't pass muster in regular economics departments because they couldn't do the kind of complex math most economists have to, many of them went off to the think tank world. And so there were 2 chapters that didn't go into the book, but where I charted essentially this diaspora that went out from George Mason of all of these people who came in and were trained in these programs at George Mason, who then went off to staff everything from the Heritage Foundation to the Reason Institute to the Independent Women's Forum to Freedom Partners Chamber of Commerce. I mean, you just go on and on and on. There are like literally hundreds.
And this is sort of parallel to what the Federalist Society did with the judiciary.
Yes, and that was part of that because they were also the the Federalist Society was also kind of applying this model, right, of using the campuses as places, sources of a talent pipeline where they would get people in, bring them in, build on the campuses, set up debates, provide fellowships, create these lush conference possibilities, et cetera, and so change the country. And here's a really dramatic example of this, actually. The field of law and economics, which has been hugely important in changing the courts and constitutional understanding in matters involving corporate prerogatives.
Richard Posner and Milieu.
Yeah, but there was an entrepreneur who was crucial in that, an academic entrepreneur like Buchanan, whom Buchanan actually arranged to get hired as the dean of the law school at George Mason in 1986. This guy's name was Henry Manny. By then, Henry Manny had already been running, since the 1970s, the kind of preeminent movement-building entrepreneurial operation to train legal scholars and sitting judges in law and economics thinking. He started it in the early 70s with seed money from Koch, continuing Koch funding through the years. By 1996, Henry Manny's summer camps had trained 2/5 of all sitting federal justices. 2/5,
Whoa.
40% of all federal judges had been through a Koch-funded curriculum in Henry Manny's summer camps. So that's really an example, I think, of the very, very shrewd way in which this arch-right libertarian cause has leveraged, in Koch's terms, academia to support their effort to transform the wider society.
Charles Koch, of course, plays a big role in this story, and this is someone that listeners will be somewhat familiar with. Tell me a little bit about his money, his political ambitions, the constellation of libertarian organizations he seeded and continued to fund, and how Buchanan fits into it.
I am not persuaded that folks on the left yet have an adequate assessment of Charles Koch's capacities, right? I think there's a certain way in which a lot of us, and I count myself, as guilty as anybody else, but there's a kind of smarty pants syndrome on the left, right? Where people think that people in the corporate world are, that they're venal. It's like Buchanan's ideas applied to the corporate world, right? That they're only venal. They're just trying to lower their tax bills and regulation, maybe not very smart, et cetera. And so I think my book also has value in the kind of know thine enemy frame, which is to say that Charles Koch is a really brilliant man, I think. He has taken a company that, yes, he inherited, but he's multiplied it a couple thousand times over the value of what he inherited. And he's done that by playing a very long game, thinking very strategically, reading constantly, and always trying to figure out how to get the edge on the competition. Now, in the business, that's the fossil fuel industry and all the other things that the Koch Industries conglomerate now controls, but it's also true of his politics. He has been serious about trying to transform the politics of the United States since at least the mid-1960s. And he has paid close attention to ideas. By his own accounting, he has funded hundreds upon hundreds of libertarian thinkers looking for the right strategy that would enable this breakthrough for a set of ideas that he knows are not popular with the people. Most people don't want to live in a libertarian world. So how to get around that? He found that strategy to get around that unpopularity in Buchanan's account of how the 20th century state grew. Koch has weaponized that to reverse engineer 20th century government to make it so we can't do anything for one another, and we're back to that Lochner world that we were talking about. But anyway, I think this is important because, and I think from the speaking I'm doing around the country and stuff, I know that people in unions and community groups and all sectors of the progressive movement are realizing that they have been too confident by half, right, or by more, in the sense that people have not been paying attention to this very, very deep, sophisticated, strategic thinking going on the right, and to this very long game that has involved multiple stages and what Koch likes to call interrelated plays. And so suddenly, after the 2010 midterms, and after Scott Walker took control in Wisconsin, and others, and this whole machine went into overdrive, people on the progressive side started realizing, hey, what's happening? Just as our
2010 was the big wake-up call, for sure.
Yeah, and just as our ideas have become ever more popular, more and more people support the basic ideas and goals, of progressives, but steadily losing power, and able to win many, many individual campaigns, whether it's for living wages or family leave or this or that, all these particular policies, particularly in urban communities and some states, but winning these campaigns, but losing the war. And so I think to understand why that's happening, we have to pay attention to the strategy that has been embraced by the other side and understand the long game of that strategy and what the end game is. And I'm really happy that I'm hearing from readers now that they are finding the book very helpful for this, for understanding what it is that the right has built and done and how they have systematically been changing the rules to disempower the left, and make corporations stronger and more dominant. And so I think that we can deal with this and we can challenge it and we can, I do believe there's definitely hope of changing this, but I do also believe it's an all hands on deck moment for democracy, and that moving forward requires a really sober assessment of what we have not been paying attention to and how important it is, and how much we need to change the rules again in order to favor democracy from what the Koch network has pulled off.